So what I'm going to do is, for the first section and for the majority of this review, it will be spoiler free. Now, I may get into some spoiler territory towards the end of the video, but I will give you fair warning before that happens. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, you are okay to watch this video until I give any spoiler warnings later on. So The Amazing Spider-Man 2 picks up after the events of the first film, and from what I can gather, it takes place a few months later. Peter Parker is still coming to terms with the events of what happened in the first film and how that affects his relationship with Gwen Stacy. Now, we're also introduced to a character called Max, played by Jamie Foxx, who's a bit of a loner who works at Oscorp, really just wants people to notice him and wants some attention. He is subject to an accident and becomes the villain known as Electro. Now, this film, I think in some territories, is actually subtitled The Rise of Electro. So while all that's happening, Peter's old school friend Harry Osborn, played by Dane DeHaan, returns to New York because his father, Norman Osborn, played by Chris Cooper, is ill and on his deathbed. So you have him come back to New York, and he sort of meets up with Peter. They try to rekindle their friendship. You also have another villain called the Rhino, played by Paul Giamatti, who's sort of knocking about on the fringes of what's going on in the main plot of this movie. And while all this is happening, Peter Parker is still, and this is a continuation of a plot thread in the first movie, he's still trying to discover and search for the truth of his parents' disappearance, which we glimpse in the first movie. So straight away from the description of the plot of this film, I think it's fairly apparent that it has a lot going on. Now, full disclosure, and if you are familiar with my channel and if you've seen my review of the first Amazing Spider-Man movie, you'll know that I didn't like that film. I am a card-carrying Spider-Man fan, and I love Sam Raimi's movies that he did, like I think it was roughly 10 years ago the first one came out. I love those movies. I even like Spider-Man 3, and I really didn't like the first Amazing Spider-Man. So going into this film, having seen the trailers and the posters and everything, I was cautiously optimistic. And what I would like to do is talk about the pros and cons of this film, starting with the pros. There's quite a lot to get through. Now, basically, the first film, one criticism I had, or a couple, were the fact that it wasn't shot in New York, which was fairly obvious at times, and it was shot on digital. And now, because in that film they were going for a dark and gritty, realistic feel, a lot of it was shot at night or was dark, and digital photography in the dark looks cheap a lot of the time, and I thought the first film was guilty of that. Well, this movie is actually shot on 35mm film, and it was shot entirely on location in New York, and it shows. It looks good, and I mean, you cannot fake a city like New York on film. So you have the look and feel of New York, and the actual photography itself is a lot nicer than the first film, and the colour palette is a lot more colourful. It's a lot more bright, a lot more primary colours, which is something I really enjoyed. It looks like a comic book on screen, and that's something that I really liked. And along with that, you have Spider-Man's new suit, which is probably the best it's ever looked on screen. It's about as close to the comics as you could get, I think. Other than the webbing under his arms and stuff, it looked really good. And I mean, that's like a minor, it's not even a nitpick, because I love the suit, whether it's got webbing or not, but it's as close to the comics as I think you could get. Now, coupling that with the fact that a lot of the action incorporates a large amount of practical effects. I mean, obviously the film has a lot of CGI in it, but I think where possible they've used practical effects, and it does show, and it looks really good, especially in a car chase which takes place at the beginning of the film with the Rhino, which you see in the trailers. A lot of that's practical, and it looks really good, so I enjoyed the use of practical effects. The score, now the score is going to be something I talk a lot more about a little later on, because it is very hit and miss, but the score, some of it, I really liked. It has a very sort of, it's by Hans Zimmer and Pharrell Williams, it has a very sort of Danny Elfman feel to it, and when it's doing that, when it's like strings and stuff going do 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 do, I loved all that stuff, and I thought it gave it a really fun tone to the scenes where that played over, so that was really good. The performances by and large are fine. I'm going to talk a little bit about Andrew Garfield in a little bit, but Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy, the Sally Field playing Aunt May, Dane DeHaan as Harry Osborn. They're all fine. I'll talk about Andrew Garfield and Jamie Foxx in a little bit, but I think the standout's probably Dane DeHaan as Harry Osborn. He's sort of creepy in the way that you want Harry Osborn to be, but also very likeable and charismatic, and has a great chemistry with Andrew Garfield. So I think Dane DeHaan's the sort of standout of the film. You do see Peter. This is another thing that I liked, an element, a potential spoiler for the first movie, but Peter hallucinates that he sees Captain Stacy, who was Gwen Stacy's dad, throughout the movie, and that was something I quite liked. That was something that gave it a little bit of an eerie feel, and something I quite enjoyed, and I like the fact that that plot point from the first film was carried through into this one, so that I enjoyed as well. The first meeting between Spider-Man and Electro, which again you see in the trailers, where Spider-Man, doesn't know who Electro is, and he basically goes up to him and says words to the effects of, look, you don't know what's happening to you, I know that you're scared, why don't you come with me away from these people and let's talk about it. And I thought that was really good in showing how a superhero can deal with a situation, a potentially threatening situation, without just throwing a punch. And that was the sort of thing that I missed in Man of Steel, and I'm glad that they did that in this film. I'm glad that it showed the hero wanting to talk it out with the villain rather than just launch into a fight. So I thought that was really good. I like the fact that they tried to have sort of Spider-Man do quips and comedy in this one. I know a lot of people said he tried to do that with the first one, but that really wasn't apparent to me. But I like the fact it has a lot more of a comedic vibe in this one. Now, I will say that a lot of the quips fell flat for me, not because of what they were, but because of Andrew Garfield's delivery. And again, I'll get onto his performance, but I don't think he came across as being overly comfortable delivering the comedic elements of the character. While the quips themselves were quite funny, and on paper I'm sure they're quite funny, his delivery of them just didn't land for me. But again, I guess that's something, because comedy is so subjective, there are some people who won't have that problem with it, but that's just my personal preference. I like the fact that the sort of first and third acts of this movie have a very sort of kids movie vibe to them. The characters are very black and white, the treatment of some of the villains, and I'll go on to talk about Jamie Foxx's performance as Electro, but the treatments of some of the villains are so broad that it feels like a kids movie, and I really enjoyed that vibe, because I feel like that set it apart from the Sam Raimi trilogy, which again is still fresh in people's memories. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. And it's a shame that in the second act it sort of strays from that and it gets lost a little bit, but when it's doing the kids movie vibe, I thought it was at its strongest. And I thought it was actually, as messy as the script is, and that's something I'll get onto, it was quite well paced. It's a 2.5 hour film, but it didn't feel like it. It flew by, and at no point during this movie was I bored. I was entertained all the way through, but that's not to say that it's a good movie, but it was entertaining. Now I'm going to get on to the cons, right? And this sort of starts with Andrew Garfield's performance as Spider-Man. Now, while I understand they wanted to go for the comedic elements of the character, which is very prominent in the comics, I don't think Andrew Garfield is overly comfortable delivering some of the witty dialogue, and when he does, it comes across that like Spider-Man's a bit of a douche. And I think that at least what Tobey Maguire did, even when Spider-Man was being a bit of a fuck up, he was always likeable and always charming, and I don't find that with Andrew Garfield's portrayal. I find him to be a bit of a dick, to be honest with you. Some of the physical comedy stuff that he does is absolutely fine. There's a scene where a character's driving a truck and he knocks on the window and asks him to roll it down, and the sort of physical stuff is absolutely fine. So it's more his delivery of the verbal quips that I just didn't quite gel with. It came across as a bit wooden and a bit sort of stilted. And that goes on to say as well that Spider-Man doesn't have an arc in this film. He doesn't have an emotional journey, really. He doesn't really learn anything about himself, despite the fact that a lot of the marketing of this film, you know, is going into like what happened to his parents and stuff, which is another criticism. That felt like a giant anticlimax, but it just doesn't feel like he went on much of a journey in this movie. It doesn't feel like really any of the characters did. So that's another criticism. What I will say as well is that the film actually starts with a scene that establishes what happened to his parents. And as I say, it's a bit anticlimactic. It's an action scene that takes place on a plane. And the way it's shot is so much shaky cam that my partner and I and our friend got home from seeing it last night. And I had to ask them what happened in that scene because I couldn't tell what was going on. So that I thought was a misstep. Again, while certain aspects of this film serve to set it apart from Sam Raimi's trilogy, a lot of it still reminds me that I'm not watching Sam Raimi's movies. Now, they do the whole sort of character stuff of basically Spider-Man is an absentee boyfriend to Gwen Stacy because of his role as Spider-Man, and that's fine because that's in the comics and stuff, but the way they present it in this is they actually sort of lift a shot from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2, I believe, and plant it in this movie, and it's Gwen giving a speech and she looks down at the audience and there's an empty chair where Peter should be sat. Which, to be honest, it reminded me too much of Spider-Man 2, and I thought, surely there's a way you could do this without aping Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 2, because you just reminded me that I'm not watching that movie, so that was another criticism. Jamie Foxx as Max Dillon / Electro. Anybody could have played that role. I don't know why they got Jamie Foxx, who is an actor that I really like and have a lot of respect for, but he plays it so broad. He's like a pantomime character, and you don't get to spend a lot of time with Max before his accident that turns him into Electro. I think he's in 2 scenes before he gets his powers, and then once he gets his powers, there's no real explanation as to why he turns evil. I mean, it's apparent that, you know, he just wants people to notice him and stuff like that, but that surely doesn't justify his actions once he has his powers, and it was just a really horribly underdeveloped character. Like, it felt in a film this long you could have had a lot more Electro in it. I mean, it's billed as the rise of Electro, but then once he has his powers, I think you have one confrontation scene with Spider-Man, and he sort of feels like he disappears for a lot of the movie. So I felt like Electro was underdeveloped and underused. And Jamie Foxx's performance was, you know, a bit too broad for me. The score that I mentioned earlier, some aspects of which I like, but whenever Electro was on screen, you have sort of a dubstep score come in, which I thought, you know, it's not to my taste, but I understand that Electro has to have a theme, so that didn't really bother me. What bothered me was the fact that it has lyrics, which basically say Electro's inner monologues over the music, and this was just completely, like, jarring and weird and distracting and just pulled me out of the movie. One line of the lyrics, and I guess it's not really a spoiler, but you hear the lyrics while Electro's looking at Spider-Man going, "He's dead to you, he's dead to you," and I thought, what am I watching? This is really bizarre and weird. Like, who, while making this movie, thought that that was a good idea? So that was really odd. Now, a lot of the plot strands, I've heard criticisms of this movie, that it tries to do too much and tries to introduce too many plots and different plot points. And while I can understand the criticism, I don't feel like it was too overloaded or that there was too many. It's just that they were all rushed. Now, you have, as I mentioned earlier, Dane DeHaan playing Harry Osborn, who later becomes a Green Goblin. Now, in the Raimi movies, they had the good sense to have Harry Osborn be in all 3 films, and it was only in the 3rd one he became the Goblin. Now, in this one, you know, we meet Harry, he establishes his friendship with Peter, and we get a bit of their backstory, and then he becomes the Goblin. And it just felt like that arc was too rushed and too... That was a film on its own. And it felt like they just wanted to get him in the Goblin suit ready for the sort of Sinister Six movie that's going to be coming up. So there was that. And because Dane DeHaan was so sort of likeable and charismatic as Harry Osborn, I wanted more of him as Harry Osborn. And that's one of the reasons that I thought having him become the Goblin in this movie. And again, it's not a spoiler because he's on the poster. it felt rushed, and it felt like they wasted Dane DeHaan, and it definitely felt like they wasted Chris Cooper as his dad, Norman Osborn, who, Chris Cooper's, you know, a great actor, and he was in it for about 2 minutes. So he felt terribly sort of underused, as did Paul Giamatti as a Rhino, who is basically relegated to cameos that sort of bookend the movie, and he's really... there's no reason for him to be there other than to introduce another villain who might sort of go on to become something in future movies. It felt like wasted screen time, so it certainly felt like a waste of Paul Giamatti, who is, again, a great actor. His performance was really bizarre as well. He's playing a Russian, and his accent was so campy that it was distracting, and had the whole film felt like that kids movie vibe, that would have been fine. But another criticism is the middle section of this movie goes from being, you know, the bright primary coloured comic book movie to being a sort of dark and gritty and a bit sort of more adult in a way. And I don't mind tonally inconsistent films. I mean, I'm somebody who really loved The Lone Ranger, but it just didn't quite gel as well as, like, The Lone Ranger got away with it, but this movie doesn't, because it goes from one extreme to the other. It felt like, you know, there was a good vibe in here somewhere, but it was just too sort of inconsistent to really get a grasp on it. Now, basically how they sort of do Gwen and Peter's relationship. Now, I'm not going to spoil it at this point, but that, again, I had a massive problem with, but I'll get on to that. The film itself, it feels like it climaxes early. It almost feels like it climaxes in the middle and then carries on. So while I thought the pacing was really good, and at no point was I bored throughout the 2.5 hours, it felt like it climaxed in the middle, and the structure was just really odd. It felt like almost the film had been cobbled together out of order in terms of the emotional beats. It just didn't quite, you know, gel together. And to be honest, I think the film is at its strongest, and this was another pro, I forgot to mention this earlier on, in its small, intimate moments, like the moments between Peter and Gwen, or the moments between Peter and May. That's clearly where Marc Webb, the director, who also did the first one, is at his most comfortable, is in those smaller moments, and those were great. But I think it's clear that he struggles to put a big movie together. It just doesn't quite fit. So, all in all, I'm going to get into spoilers in a moment, but I'll just tie up, for those of you who haven't seen it, to summarise for you guys. I would say that the film itself is bullshit, really. It's not a good movie, it's shit, really, but it's enjoyable. It's a guilty pleasure. It's the sort of film that you would, if you had people over, you could put it on and you could all sort of talk over it, but you know, you would still enjoy sort of glancing over it. It's, at no point was I bored. I actually enjoyed watching it. There's a lot to say about this movie. I mean, my partner saw this with me, and, you know, she said that she actually preferred this to Captain America: The Winter Soldier, because there's more to talk about. Now, I won't go that far, because I loved The Winter Soldier, and this is a bad film, and she agrees that this is a bad film. But it's enjoyable. It's a guilty pleasure, and I would recommend going to see it. I mean, I really didn't like the first one, and thought that this has a lot more going for it in terms of style and different plots and stuff. It's just more interesting than the first one. It's just a shame it's so poorly put together. So it's a messy movie that has, you know, some redeeming qualities, but the cons far outweigh the pros. That's not to say it's not enjoyable, so I'd recommend it. Anyway, I want to get into sort of spoiler territory now. And the reason being is, so if you haven't seen the film yet and you don't want it spoiled, switch off now. But the reason I want to get into spoilers now is the Peter and Gwen relationship and how that's tied up. Because I know that in the comic books, Gwen Stacy dies, and that was a defining moment for Spider-Man. I have a problem with that way of telling a story. I have a problem with that element of storytelling. It's something that's been around for, no doubt, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of years in storytelling. I don't like it when a female character is either killed off or maimed or held to ransom just to motivate the male lead character. It's an outdated trope of storytelling, and I wish it would go away. Now, during this film, they make noises that Glenn that would be a very different film, that Gwen might leave Peter to go to Oxford in England, and it would mean that they could no longer be together because of the distance. And I thought that is a really interesting way to have the same effect as Gwen's death, but not have her be killed off and tossed aside, because basically it establishes that Gwen's got her own life. She's got her own stuff going on. She's not going to follow Peter and Spider-Man. You know, she has her own life to live, and I liked that, and I wanted her to leave and go to Oxford, and then he can pine after her the same way he could be, as if she was, you know, she died, but they wouldn't have had to kill her off. They even have a scene where Gwen says to Peter, you know, nobody makes my decisions for me. You can't tell me to stay here. You know, you think you're looking after me. I make my own decisions. And I was like, fair enough. They're actually acknowledging, you know, that she's an interesting female character and stuff. And I thought that they weren't going to kill her off. And then they kill her off. And I feel like, if anything, it's more annoying and more cheap than had they just killed her. To have the character turn around and acknowledge almost the tropes of this sort of genre, you know, and have her confront and acknowledge the treatment of females in these movies, and then kill her off anyway. It almost feels like they're trying to buy the right to kill her off in the narrative, and it just didn't sit right with me whatsoever. It was really just a cheap way of trying to get around it, if anything, it annoyed me more than it would have if he just killed her off. And again, it's something that's been around in storytelling for so long that it'll probably never change, sadly. But I would like to get to the point where you don't have to motivate a man by taking his woman away. You know, it's annoying and it's outdated, and it's, you know, what are we, cavemen? And she even says that to him at one point, you know, what are you, a caveman, sort of thing. So that really didn't sit right with me. That's my main problem with the movie. And like I say, it felt like they were going to work around it, but then they didn't, and I was just, it's pissed me off. And I know that you would get fanboys kicking off if they didn't kill her off and had to leave, but honestly, you know, in the comics it was outdated and it was written years ago. Are we not past this yet? So that was my main problem with that. To be honest, the film does have a lot of flaws, and they do outweigh what it does right, but it's an enjoyable film nonetheless. I don't know, like, I feel like the Gwen thing really just threw me out of the movie. That and the fact, the way they kill her, there's a scene where she's falling inside this bell tower and Spider-Man fires his web shooters in slow motion, and the end of the web as it's going towards her turns into a hand, and I just thought, that's really naff. Like, we get it, he's trying to catch her, but really, you know, do we need it spelled out for us like that? And the actual way she dies, though, is very brutal, and people in the audience winced. I winced. I actually thought to myself, how did you get that into a 12 certificate movie, or a PG-13 as it will be in America? That really surprised and shocked me. And that was in the sort of weirdly darker middle section of the movie when compared to the primary coloured kid vibe, you know, first and third act. So that was a problem I had with it. But overall, I actually enjoyed this movie, believe it or not. I know I've sat here and I've torn it apart like a cooked chicken, but I actually enjoyed watching it. It was fun, you know, and I will be interested to see, because they do a lot of world building around the Sinister Six, and, you know, they hint at future Spider-Man characters and all that. The fact that this film has not had the warmest of receptions, and I don't doubt that it'll have a big opening weekend, but I think that there will be a significant drop-off once word of mouth starts to spread. I do wonder if that will prompt Sony to maybe come knocking at Marvel's door. You know, let's get Spider-Man into the Avengers. You know, we all want it, the comic book fans want it, the cast of Spider-Man want it. If you've seen the interviews that have been knocking around, they all want to do it. Just do it. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I've already summarised for the people who have already left the video, but I'd recommend seeing this film because it is so bizarre. Some of the choices, like, you know, the lyrics over the score and stuff for Electro, the film itself is mad as a toilet brush. It's not a good film, but it is enjoyable, and I was never bored throughout it. So it has a lot more going for it for the first one, and I will rewatch this movie a lot more than I'll rewatch the first one, and I enjoyed it despite the fact that it's shit. So yeah, that's my review of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Please feel free to leave comments and rate and subscribe and all that good stuff. I always read every comment. If you do want to share your thoughts, just please stay away from spoilers in the comment section. Thank you for watching this video, I do appreciate it, and I will catch you all later. Bye-bye.